Morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this webinar this morning. LiveEO, TradeAware and PEFC will be discussing EUDR for rubber, so turning compliance into a business opportunity. Today, the webinar speakers will be myself. My name is Scott Breadmore. I'm the VP of the supply chain business here at LiveEO. Sean Go from PEFC APAC, the value chain manager. And Chris Bell, LiveEO's Senior Product Manager for TradeAware. So the agenda for the session today, we'll be framing the challenges for the rubber supply chain specifically related to EUDR, how you can leverage EUDR to boost your market share and margins, and how you can get ahead of the challenges around EUDR, best practices for secure data collection and sharing, and then why data accuracy matters and best practices. At the end of this call, we will be moderating questions. So you can ask the panel any questions that may arise or you can think of during the presentations. So let's take a look at the preconditions or what's needed for compliance and the challenges around that for EUDR. So the EUDR regulation poses significant challenges for the rubber industry, particularly from a smallholder perspective, smallholder farmers. Information, the required information is often difficult to fulfill for fragmented smallholders, particularly when you look at the available resources, technology, and the detail, the level of detail that's needed or the data that's needed to be provided. So it's going to create risks that buyers potentially may favour, the larger, more organised suppliers who can more easily meet data requirements. So the risk there is that there could be some marginalising of smallholders. The next thing is the EU deforestation data often has poor quality, right? So it can trigger false alerts. So this leads to a couple of issues, and it needs to be taken very seriously in the sense that it could mean fewer rubber products actually are eligible for the EU market, which creates huge problems for producers. Parts of the supply chain may be disqualified, causing issues for the downstream companies. So there's a lot to be considered, particularly when you talk about competitive advantage when you're adapting or changing the challenges for EUDR. Next slide. Thank you. So how to leverage or gain a market share to boost revenue. Despite the challenges, all compliance actually presents significant opportunities, particularly for proactive rubber producers. Faster compliance will allow for producers to gain market share as they become preferred suppliers for EU or for EU buyers. A higher share of compliant products means more flexibility in operations and potentially higher margins or preferred status. So it is a huge competitive advantage to get ahead of this compliance. Performing due diligence now will give companies a head start for the upcoming regulation. It positions you guys as leaders in the industry and gives you that competitive advantage. And it enables you to capitalize on opportunities. So you're going to get this fast, scalable, and accurate method of demonstrating compliance, which is going to be crucial, right, for competitiveness. So companies that can invest now in robust compliance and systems around compliance can turn this EUDR challenge into a competitive advantage. And that's what you're going to hear from the guys on the panel today. So I hope you take a lot away from the session.
All right, thanks, Scott. So hi, everyone. As Scott mentioned, Chris Bell, Senior Product Manager here at LiveEO for TradeAware. So going to take you through, going to talk a little bit about our approach to some of these challenges that Scott mentioned. With TradeAware, we have developed a solution that covers the whole end-to-end of EUDR. And so you can see here the modules that we have. So you can see the upfront piece of focusing on gathering data, of getting plot data, of running supplier questionnaires to get information for legality assessment or for risk assessment, our modules around assessing risk, so having the highest precision deforestation analytics possible, and assessing other risk factors and evaluating suppliers. So risk factors related to legality or other considerations that are in the regulation. And then, of course, proving that compliance. So tying supplier data to individual products and shipments, and of course, sending that through into the EU information system, into EU traces, and reusing existing submissions. And then, of course, being aware that this is such a large-scale challenge for companies, making sure that that's addressed both in an easy-to-use application, but also via API for this happening in bulk. We're really going to focus on a couple of those today, really around the plots and the deforestation. So let's talk about the plots first. So in Article 9 of the regulation, you have your information requirements. So the information that you have to provide on a product basis. And there's information that you likely have. So you likely, of course, know the product of the quantity that you're bringing into the market. You'll know the contact information of your suppliers, of course. But the information you're going to need for this, among others, but the one we focus on today is really knowing the geolocation of the plots of land and knowing the country of production, which of course flows from this. You'll also need information on compliance with local legislation, but we'll not focus on that topic today. And those first two really being a precondition for getting to the point of proving that there's adequately conclusive and verifiable information that the products are deforestation free. Next slide, Andreas.
Chris, can we just pause for a moment? Someone's just mentioned in the question box that they would like the slides to be bigger. So is that possible? I think someone or a few of the people are struggling to read or view the slides. Thank you.
I don't know that we can change that, Andrea.
Maybe, I don't think we can change it. So it would be interesting if several users face this problem. Otherwise, what you can try is hover over the presentation, basically, and then there could be two arrows for you to expand the element, basically. So okay, yeah, maybe it's an individual issue. So if you can try that, hover over the presentation and then press the two slides to expand the presentation element, presentation tile. Thank you.
Okay, I think we're seeing it's proving okay for other people. Okay, so but hopefully that helps. Hopefully that helps with that problem, Natalie, and you're able to see that. Okay, great. Thanks, Andreas. Could you progress to the next slide as well? Brilliant. So, we understand the problems of collaboration with suppliers, and we recognize that there's a few different challenges that you face, and then we'll talk about our approaches to those. So, of course, one of the biggest challenges is low awareness and engagement. Of course, we still see that a lot of people aren't aware of the regulation and the regulations implications. So our message to that is to provide training to suppliers, both on the obligations that their buyers have, but also on the benefits of going through this process. And so training is really something we're emphasizing and providing to suppliers as well. Suppliers don't want to share contact details of their sub-suppliers. And our answer to that would be to reassure and only collect EUDR relevant information. So we'll talk a little bit about our commercial network in a minute, but the privacy aspect of this is something we've really embedded. So we're making sure we're only collecting the data that's absolutely necessary for compliance with the regulation. And not exposing any information about sub-suppliers, so you can be confident that your business relationships won't be compromised, but you'll be able to provide the data to your buyers that they need. And then data needs to be verified and accurate. And our answer to that would be to standardize and use a single tool to really request that geolocation data. We're also trying to make sure that within this, there's a pretty standardized format for the data that you need as relates to the EU. So eventually this all has to go into this EU traces system. And so making sure you bring it into that sort of single simple format is also a big consideration for us. Next slide, Andreas. So how do we simplify the geolocation collection problem? So we really say there's these sort of three options. If you know the plots, if you have access to that data, then you can put them into Tradeaway yourself. So you can manually draw plots. Conscious that obviously if you're adding a lot of them to the system, that's probably quite a slow process. So you can also bulk upload files. And if you don't know them, you can delegate the request, and we'll talk more about this. This is our commercial network, but you can send the request to your supplier and they could send it to their supplier. And that can happen as many levels down the chain as required. And then, of course, with the way we've set the system up, it means that if your suppliers are already on the platform, then they can share their data as well. So what we've set up is this system where people can join the network and share information with each other. And then, of course, that's all happening in an environment where we've embedded privacy as a SOC 2 compliant vendor. Apologies if you're picking up any background noise. It appears there's some work going on outside of my my building at the minute. Next slide, Andreas. And then just to speak about the commercial network. So the way this works is it's a way for people to easily connect with their suppliers and request geolocations for free. So you can see here, we have an operator here. This is the company that's subject to the EUDR. They're the ones who are bringing the tires onto the market, making them available on the EU market. They can send a request to their tier 1 supplier, who can send it to their tier 2 supplier, and so on and so forth. And what happens with this is we are only showing the data back one layer in the supply chain. So the tire company would only see Svensson Rubber's information, and Svensson Rubber would only see the co-op's information. But what the tire company will see is the plots rolled up into Svensson Rubber. So they'll see all the plots associated with Svensson Rubber, but they won't see all of the suppliers and sub-suppliers behind that, which really makes sure that we're preserving that privacy, as I mentioned, so you don't have to worry about that information being shared beyond what's absolutely necessary. Brilliant. In that case, I'll hand over to Sean. If that's a sort of digital representation of all of this, then Sean's going to talk through what that looks like in the real world.
Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you for having me on this webinar, and glad to present PEFC's EUDR solutions to the rubber stakeholders. Maybe let me just kick off and quickly share that this is 25 years. This year will mark PEFC's 25 years. And for 25 years, PEFC has had significant, very in-depth experience with timber legality. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is because EUDR naturally has evolved from EUTR, which is the EU Timber Regulations, with, of course, different commodities added to it and newer definitions. But at its core, PEFC certification system has this due diligence system, which really aligns with EUDR's requirements. So for today, we're really zeroing in on tool number 2. And then we're going to discuss how does PEFC's EUDR DDS module supports the rubber stakeholders, especially for the smallholder community that's highly fragmented. So next slide, please. So how does this controlled source help with the due diligence reporting? Under PEFC's Chain of Custody 2020 standards, the due diligence system it's a mandatory requirement in order to achieve this certificates. So I hope for the audiences here, if you haven't start your journey with getting PEFC Chain of Custody, I think this is a good opportunity to start now. And this process of due diligence will collect and uncover all of this information needed for the reporting. As you can see here, especially within the Southeast Asian region for the rubber smallholder farmers, there's very different pieces of different areas and different pieces where it's highly fragmented. So for the primary processor or the primary collecting point, there are different scenarios that they have to deal with. Primarily, it falls down to these two case scenarios. And the idea here of this visual is to share what actually happens within the rubber supply chain higher upstream. And I think this partnership with software service providers will really help reflect that in the digital world and also streamline the reporting and make things a lot easier. And in terms of verification, this is some of the key things that we will ensure that a third party comes and conducts the audit. Next slide, please. So once you have your PFC chain of custody, there's an additional module, which is the EUDR DDS. Now, this EUDR DDS, after updated, you can specify this PFC EUDR claim on your materials, as well as contribute to the overall reporting. So any material that's going through the PFC EUDR DDS resulted in negligible risk can be declared as PEFC EUDR in invoices, delivery document, as well as your reporting. Now, the claim together with the chain of custody, you can also report PEFC EUDR percentage and also PEFC controlled source. The idea here is that we're trying to help the supply chain streamline their proactive due diligence in order for them to be able to get a competitive advantage to be able to access the European market. Next slide. So now, how does this all work? On the extreme left, sorry, let me start by the three different categories. First would be the PEFC EUDR reference. This would definitely comply with the EUDR requirements. And then the PEFC EUDR non-reference would be for products that don't need the EUDR reference numbers. And then last but not least will be the non-PEFC EUDR. Now, why these three material classification? Let's start from the right-hand side, non-PEFC EUDR. As Scott mentioned earlier, I think that good actors and proactiveness really helps the supply chain move, especially after post-COVID. And these new regulations puts a strain on companies who are still trying to get back to where they're performing prior to COVID. So what does this mean at EUDR? If you have conducted this PEFC EUDR DDS, if your customers are not within the EU market, you can still use this claim. Let's say, for example, Australia or US. This shows the proactiveness that you have done your due diligence and have mitigated potential risks that assures your customers in overseas market. And then on the middle side, where it says PEFC EUDR non-reference numbers, this means that this product doesn't fall into scope, but the product material is still going into Europe region. And then last but not least, if your customer requires EUDR claim, all of the 4 claims can be addressed. PEFC EUDR claim, PEFC chain of custody claims, EU reference number, and the information to be obtained. The additional EUDR due diligence will provide this information, and therefore those information will help with your customers' reporting requirements. All in all, I mean, certification comes with some sort of additional cost. However, if it's done on a landscape level, on a larger scale, I think this could be really cost effective, especially for PEFC. And then secondly, I think in the market, there has been this segregation of different types of claims calling for different types of premiums, which is really unintentional, but henceforth the market. I think the key takeaway message here is that with this new EUDR due diligence system, you're able to report against PEFC chain of custody claims and EUDR. So ideally, what we're hoping that the supply chains will do is to support the smallholder communities and ensure that their livelihoods are supported and that they can access global markets. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Sean. So just to bring it back to this point of, we talked a little bit about the plots and the way you get the plot data. Of course, that's the first point of needing to know those geolocations. And then the next step, of course, is trying to get to this point of what we can consider adequately conclusive and verifiable information that they're deforestation free. And what we want to talk about here really is just why a company like LiveEO is working on this problem, and what we're doing about it. So the challenge that we see is there are a lot of existing data sets out there around deforestation, but they're mostly using the wrong methodology. They're focused on things like tree cover loss and not the actual land use change. So with what that means is that effectively it's looking at when trees are cut down or cut back, rather than what the land was being used for in the first place. So the problem you can run into is a rubber plantation has a cutback event that's picked up by that analysis because it is a tree cover loss event, but it isn't actually a relevant event for the regulation, because the regulation is concerned with conversion from natural forest to agriculture. And obviously that can particularly hurt businesses impacted by that, because it runs the risk of them excluding product from the EU market that's actually compliant. And of course, that in turn can lead to price pressure. Next slide, Andreas. So to talk a little bit about some of the data sources that we're seeing and why they're having these problems. The first one we see is the JRC Global Map of Forest Cover for 2020. This is a map that's been produced by the EU's Joint Research Council as a sort of a tool to help around compliance. I would like to sort of point out that as a map, the EU's been very clear. This has no legal standing. It's not actually it's not actually a guarantee of compliance, but it's really just intended as something to help to assess this. So in terms of what it's looking at natural forest cover, which is aligned with the FAO definition, which is what's in the EUDR as of 2020. That in itself, from a definitional perspective, is not particularly challenging, although we do see in some areas, for example, we know there are programs in Brazil where farmers are paid to maintain natural forest in the areas that are under their control. So natural forest is a sort of necessary but not sufficient condition for deforestation. You have to have the natural forest that's then been converted to agriculture. So there's some potential for false positives there. And then what's it's based on? It's based on a collection of existing sources down to 10-meter resolution. When we talk about meters and resolution, I think this can be quite confusing for anybody who doesn't come from the geospatial field. But essentially what we mean there is simply, when we say 10-meter resolution, we mean each individual pixel is 10 meters by 10 meters. So you can imagine that's a sort of, I think I really like Sean's analogy of imagining going from the digital, from the real world to the digital world. And in this scenario, going from the real world of having the rubber plantation to this digital world of being able to see something at 10 meters by 10 meters being an individual pixel. So you imagine you lose a lot of information in that process. And what's its accuracy? So in the report that the JRC published, the accuracy of this was 76.6%. Would emphasize that there's probably some crowding out effects there, because a lot of areas aren't particularly contested, of course. If you're in the middle of the rainforest, it's most data sets would agree that is, of course, natural forest. The problems we've seen with this are at the edges. So on test sets, we've seen false positives as high as 99%. And it's particularly, that's been particularly pronounced for rubber plantations, because it just is the most similar to a natural forest from the analytics perspective. So we have seen some real challenges with this data set. Next slide, Andreas. Brilliant. And then one of the other big data sets that we're seeing a lot of people use is GLAD tree cover loss. This goes by a few different names. It's GLAD, which is a research center. People also refer to it as UMD, which is the University of Maryland, and some people call it Hansen, which is the lead researcher there. But basically, this data set is looking at tree cover loss. And as I mentioned, there may be a lot of reasons why you have tree cover loss that aren't deforestation. The main one just being you're doing harvesting or renovation activity that means that trees are being cut down, and those do get picked up as a tree cover loss event. So it's making sure it's definitionally aligned. The problem you have here is that again, tree cover loss is a necessary condition of deforestation, but it's not a sufficient condition of deforestation because you have to know what the land was to begin with. And that's using 30-meter Landsat data. So if you think about the previous example where you have a 10-meter by 10-meter pixel, with Landsat, we have a 30-meter by 30-meter pixel. So again, a massive loss of resolution. And then what's the accuracy? In reports we've seen, the false positive rate runs at 13% and the false negative rate runs at 12%. But what I'd emphasize there is that's accuracy on the problem that it's looking at. So it's accuracy on tree cover loss, not accuracy on deforestation. So you really have to take those two things together. It's how good is it at the thing that it's trying to do? And because the thing that it's trying to do is not entirely aligned with the problem, it sort of has a compounding effect there. And I would also emphasize it varies geographically quite a bit on the accuracy. So we know it's better in some regions than others. Next slide, Andreas. So to talk a little bit about what we're doing with our analysis, what we focused on is making sure, first off, that it's very definitionally aligned with the regulation. So rather than focusing on tree cover loss, rather than focusing on the existence of a natural forest, what we're looking at is conversion from natural forest to agriculture. So really making that perfectly definitionally aligned. We've based it on data that uses a much higher resolution. So we've been using a combination of sources that bring it down to 5 meters by 5 meters. So that just means we can see more of what's going on. And what's its accuracy? We've hit 96% in test sets. And I'd really emphasize on this as well that we really placed a lot of emphasis on solving this for rubber as a really sort of interesting and important commodity for us to tackle. Next slide, Andreas. And then, of course, if that's sort of the micro level of what happens with these individual plots, then of course we have what's the macro of what does that mean for an individual business. I think the point here is that this is a sort of like the law of big numbers. One individual plot being excluded is of course a challenge, but when you apply that at the scale of a whole supply chain, it starts to become incredibly costly. And so when we've been working with companies in the rubber industry, what we've been able to do is to help them avoid really significant restructuring costs, because they're able to work with suppliers that we've been able to accurately determine don't have EUDR relevant deforestation in their supply chain. So they don't need to disqualify those suppliers. They avoid the restructuring of the supply chain that might result from that. And then, of course, on the other side, also because we're using this much higher resolution, we're able to improve the ability to catch actual deforestation, so reducing the risk of any fines or reputational damage that might result there as well. Great. So I think that's pretty much it from us. So Scott, I can hand over to you for the Q&A.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So guys, we've got a couple of questions, and I'm guessing the first one is for you, Sean. Any PEFC, EUDR, DDS for self-learning programs?
Yes, I've basically shared the link over there. The standards are out. Please have a look and read. Depending on which country you're in, our national governing body will be there definitely to support you. So for example, if you're sitting in Malaysia or Thailand, look for PFC's, you know what, maybe just, I'll just put the link there so it'll be easier for people to search.
Thank you, Sean. Appreciate that. Question from Vikas, Chris. How do you check the accuracy?
Yeah, it's a good question. So really, we do two types of validation there. One is we have a team that's doing desk validation. So we have a team that's that also creates our training data for our AI, but they also do the desk validation. So what they're using is high resolution base maps, and they're using those to look at the areas and basically check and correct the output of our algorithms. The other thing we're also doing is working with the companies that we're working with to get ground truthing data as well, which again very much the gold standard there. So we are being very conscious that of how we can improve that accuracy over time through those methods. So having that team really check our data, correct it, and make sure it's improving the algorithms over time, and of course getting the ground truth data as well. Just to mention, because I was one of our colleagues has prodded me to explain this a little better. But what do we mean by false positives and false negatives? I think this is a really interesting thing. But when you get into the world of classification, and as a sort of machine learning problem, we think about this as a classification problem. You basically have four outcomes when you're classifying something. You have a true positive, which is you correctly assigned the class. You have a true negative, which is you correctly didn't assign the class. So for us, a true positive is saying yes, that's deforestation, and a true negative is saying no, that's not deforestation. That's the good scenario. The more challenging scenario is when you get into a false positive and a false negative. So false positive is when we say, yes, there is deforestation there when there's not. And that's the side where that becomes really challenging for companies and suppliers where there isn't deforestation in their supply chain. So that's people who are being wrongfully excluded from the supply chain. And that's been a big focus for us of improving on the open source data sets that are out there to remove as many false positives as possible. On the false negative side, that's when you incorrectly don't assign deforestation. So there is deforestation, but you say there isn't. So that's really the other side of the coin there, and that's also something that we are really trying to improve as well.
Thank you, Chris. That leads on to the next one nicely, actually, from Jeff. Who audits on the ground?
Yeah, from our side, that's been basically whoever our clients are working with. So it's whoever they're bringing from a ground truthing perspective. We have a few partners that we're also working with in that space. If there's someone that if you're looking for help there, but also happy to work with if you have a preferred provider in that place as well already.
Thanks, Chris. Next question comes from Annie. How do you handle geolocation data from countries such as China, where the national approach to geolocation formats differ to those specified within the EEC?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's a very, very challenging question. So if you can get the data to us and you can let us know the coordinate reference system, then we'll be able to help with conversion. The challenge that you of course have is actually getting the data out of China. We partner with a major law firm, and we've spoken to their offices around this. And one of the big challenges you have is that most of this asset data from China is being sort of they're banning the export of it because it's viewed as a strategic asset. In that scenario, it's much more complicated. And while we can do a lot as a service provider, we can help with conversion of data if you can provide the reference system for us to be able to make that conversion. the thing we can't help with is the larger diplomatic challenge of China and the EU and what's going to happen there with exports. So I'm quite optimistic that with another year, the EU and China will be able to resolve that, because I think we've seen so far from the guidance from the EU, it's been very much, they're standing firm on geolocations will be a hard requirement, and resolve that with the Chinese government, who at the minute are standing quite firm on not allowing the export of that data.
Brilliant. Thanks, Chris. Do we have any more questions from anyone viewing the webinar? I think Annie's was the last one so far. Oh, Praveen, will EUDR introduce a certain tax for importing rubber products in line with CBAM?
Yeah, I mean, you could argue. I mean, you could argue that regulation in itself basically is a form of tax, I suppose, because it's adding an extra cost to what you're doing. There's no formal mechanism in there. There's no actual tax that's introduced on the goods, but of course, you do have the cost of compliance, and again, that's something that we're very concerned with, making sure that we can keep that as low as possible through automation and through making sure that you don't have to check as much of this data as possible. So yeah, no formal mechanism, but of course costs will rise in the process of compliance.
Yeah, thank you. Really good questions from the group so far. Is there anything else from anyone? Just to confirm, after this call, you will receive obviously the recording and the documentation, what we presented this morning. So you'll have all of that as well. And of course, our email addresses are on the screen right now. So please reach out if you'd like to engage further and have any questions, or would like to have a more specific discussion about your use cases. We'd be happy to support that. Do we have any further questions from the group? Right, looks like that's it, guys. So thank you everyone for your time. Both the people that have VCAS, last minute, gone. 1 minute, VCAS. Does your EUDR use its own data set to verify deforestation? If so, would there be a conflict with two data sets? That's a great question.
Yeah, this is a really good question. So what's going on here is the EU are providing tools around this. So this is what this JRC data set is. It's a data set that's been produced by the EU, but they've been very clear it's not an official tool for compliance. It's not the sort of the truth, I would say, when it comes to compliance. They also recognize there's a lot of issues with that data set, and so I think what we're going to see is that data set will be used by competent national authorities. We've spoken to a few of them. That mostly, I think, is in some ways a political thing. They mostly know there are issues with the data set, but they have to use it because it's been provided by the EU. But because they know those issues with it, they're willing to also have additional data sets come along. So I think what you're likely to see as a workflow around this is you check against the JRC, which is also something that we've built into our tool. You check against the JRC, you check against another data set, such as trade-aware precision, and then you can explain the difference between the two. So from our side, that's quite simple, really. It's, we have the data from the JRC, we have the data from our analytics, and the difference between the two is really the difference in methodology and approach that they're taking.
Brilliant, thank you. Praveen, with another great question. Tracking back to suppliers is a big task. How does LiveEO overcome that in terms of quality of data?
Yeah, that's a good question as well. So that's really the focus of our commercial network as well. So this is a way of being able to create these long-standing connections between suppliers. The way we've set this up is basically as a very similar to a social network, basically. But I can go in and I can send a request to Scott, for example, who in turn can send a request to Sean, and that can go on for as many levels as you need to get to your supplier. And what that does is then I'm able to see the data from Scott without seeing Sean's name and Sean's details, but seeing the plots that have been uploaded. And so again, that's a way where we're very concerned about making sure that privacy is embedded in this, but also that there's adequate tooling there to actually to get the plot data as well. We're also conscious that a big piece of this, aside from privacy, is the training side, of course. And so that's something that we're putting in place as well, working with the companies that we're working with, is doing training for their suppliers so they know how to get onto this platform to add their data and to use it.
Good. Great stuff. So looking at that, I think that's all the questions now. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Sean, for all your support today with the presentations and answering the questions. As we said before, we will send you all the documentation from the presentation and the recording. And please feel free to reach out to myself or Sean if you have any further questions. We'd be happy to help. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you, everyone.